Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, possibly good evening to some of you. I'm Christina Bennett, Chief Executive of Start Network, and welcome to this next session of our Start Network Assembly. It is now our keynote speech, so I wanted to just give a few words of introduction before passing over to our keynote speaker. So, a few months after I began my role at Start Network, I sought our keynote speaker's help. Dr. Sriskandarajah, then CEO of Oxfam GB and Start Network member, had been on my radar for some time. He'd been the Secretary General of Civicus, a global network dedicated to strengthening citizen action. He'd been on the UN's high-level panel for humanitarian financing, and he was already injecting new life into Oxfam, then an organization that was really wrestling with some scandal and some financial difficulties. And when we finally met, it was during COVID, and we met on a picnic table. I don't know if you remember that, Danny, in Greater London. And my question to him at the time was, what can be done to get international organizations on board with Start Network's shift to locally led action? And what he said to me was, it's hard, but it's not impossible. It's about reconnecting INGOs to their purpose, to their activist roots, by taking conversations like localization and community accountability out of the academic, out of the conceptual, the intellectual, the policy realm, and connecting it to the very concern for humanity and social justice and civil society space that had launched those very INGOs in the first place. And now, as CEO at the New Economics Foundation, a progressive think tank, Danny has published a book with many of those thoughts. Power to the People, Use Your Voice to Change the World. So I asked Danny to speak today because the themes of Danny's work, especially the idea of empowering people to be agents of change, resonate deeply with the mission of Start Network. And as many of you know, Start Network is committing to transforming the humanitarian system, but we always need to keep in our hearts that it is the people that make up this network, the people that we serve, that are the energy and the ambition behind this transformation. They will be the ones to lead us to the solutions we seek. So Danny's book, Power to the People, describes that by using our anger, our activism, our agency, people can transform our troubled times to the future that we want, the century of the citizen. But I'll let Danny talk about how that might be done. Danny, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Christina, and hello, everyone. It's fantastic to be back at a Start Network event, and long before that meeting with Christina, which I do remember very well, I had the privilege of being involved in some of the early discussions when the Start Fund, as you were then called, was being created. I was then at Civicus. And then, as Christina mentioned, I had the honor of serving in the UN high-level panel on humanitarian financing that Kristalina Georgieva and Sultan Nasrin Shah co-chaired, and in some ways led to the creation of the Grand Bargain. And I remember the excitement of the creation of the Start Network because, what you're trying to do, which is to reform and modernize and make more people-centric the humanitarian system, is exactly the right thing to do. And what I wanted to reflect on today, and drawing, as Christina says, on my new book, is I think there's a wider challenge, maybe even a wider responsibility that we all have. So it's necessary to reform, modernize, localize the humanitarian system, but it's also necessary to think about the wider systems in which we operate. And that's my basic argument. I want to go back a bit, though, to your history, and I want to read from the Start Network's own website, where you talk about your history. And it says, I quote, "The Start Network was born out of frustration with the state of a humanitarian system that had not kept up with the changes in the world. Much of the current system was shaped in the aftermath of the Second World War. There were high hopes for institutions like the UN and a handful of recently formed international aid agencies. But in the 7 decades since, humanitarian crises have come and gone with ever-increasing frequency. Now there is widespread acknowledgement that for many reasons, the system is no longer fit for the challenges of the 21st century." And first of all, I couldn't agree more. I think the hope, the optimism, the power of the humanitarian principles that we're all trying to live up to are still powerful, still important, but the system that we're part of feels no longer fit for purpose. But I'd go further. I think that the wider systems in which we live, particularly the political and economic systems that most of us are part of, are also, I would argue, no longer fit for 21st century purpose. And the reason I was delighted to come speak to Start Network members and partners is that I think those of us in civil society who work in the humanitarian sector, in human rights, in community action, I think we have a particular responsibility to lead by example in delivering the new systems the world needs. I think we have a particular opportunity, a responsibility to come up with bold solutions, to show that another world is possible, to demonstrate new forms of solidarity between people, across countries, at the global level. And I say that not because of some naive idealism, but because I don't think the state, the governments in many of the countries that we live in, or businesses, private sector agents, the state nor the market are going to come up with the solutions that we need. Because in some ways we are in the mess that we're in because those 20th century institutions that we've created no longer feel fit for purpose. And that we need to think about what those new systems are going to look like, need to look like, and that we have a particular responsibility to lead by example in delivering them. So let me explain, but before I do, let me go right back to an event I was at about 15 years ago. I was sitting in the headquarters of the United Nations in New York, in one of those big meeting rooms that some of you may have been in, and there was a panel with lots of ministers from different parts of the world, and it was an event about international development. And I happened to be sitting next to Professor Robert Chambers, who some of you may know is a long-established champion of what's called participatory development, of putting people at the heart of international development. And Professor Chambers was laughing to himself as this meeting went. And this meeting went for hours, and there were ministers and officials and UN bureaucrats who spoke. And after a while, I couldn't resist asking him, I said, Professor Chambers, why are you laughing? And he showed me this little piece of paper that he had where he was playing what he called buzzword bingo. And I said, what's buzzword bingo? And he said, well, when he comes to these high-level meetings, he lists all the buzzwords that we use in our sector: partnerships, cooperation. And he was laughing because he said, look, all of these buzzwords just keep coming up. And then he pointed to the piece of paper which said people, where it said people. And he said, look, no one has mentioned people in their speeches. And he said, how can that be that we're in a global forum talking about development cooperation, but people are missing? And I thought to myself, wow, that is such a powerful demonstration of how we've built this amazing architecture, these amazing institutions that have done a world of good. I'm not for a moment saying that we have not done a good job, but we've built these systems and institutions and created these spaces where people are missing. And I want to talk about 3 systems as a prompt, a provocation for you, where I think if we are to have any chance of achieving sustainable development, of protecting democracy, of promoting equality, of creating sustainable systems, 3 systems in which we have to put the people back. And that's where I think we have our special power, people like us who care about civil society, about communities, about people power. And the 3 systems are democracy, the economy, and civil society itself. And let me say something about democracy, which is, I'm sure, high on many of our minds, because analysis after analysis suggests that democracy is at its weakest that it's been for decades. There was one Cambridge University study that looked at 154 countries that call themselves democracy and found that the institutions are under greater threat than ever before in their studies because there's low levels of voter engagement, low levels of trust in political institutions, high levels of division within politics, that civic freedoms, those freedoms that we should have to organize, to assemble, to express ourselves, are under threat in unimaginable ways. I mean, if you're interested in proof of that, have a look at the Civicus Monitor, which is the monitor that Civicus, the organization I used to work at, produces that looks at these civic freedoms around the world. And it shows that only 3% of humanity live in countries where we are truly free to express ourselves, to come together within civil society, to do peaceful protest, to speak truth to power. And that the 97% of us, even though we live in so-called democracies, are finding that people power is being crushed. And I think if we are to have any chance of making this the century of the citizen, we have to look again at how democracy works, because the lesson surely is that an election every few years between two parties that look very similar, led by elites, in collusion with corporate or private sector elites, is not how democracy should be working. Democracy should be about us, about people, about much more everyday forms of democracy in which we can participate more frequently and be part of deliberative democracy rather than just electoral democracy. And there, I think we have an important role, that those of us in civil society, if we're doing our job properly, then we should be engaging with communities in more meaningful ways, amplifying voices that are not being heard, creating the safe spaces for dialogue and debate, and amplifying people's power and into political institutions, or demanding human rights, or speaking on the international stage. So my first point is the democratic system feels more frail than ever before. And the key to it, I think, is to put people back at its heart, to think about more everyday deliberative mechanisms. And I think those of us who work in civil society have a particular advantage at creating and strengthening and scaling up these sorts of models. But it also means standing together, that we can't say, we're humanitarians, we're just doing good over here, and those people under attack over there, well, they're not us. We have to stand together, because divided, we will fall. And the demonization I see across the world of civil society, particularly those of us who dare to speak up about women's rights, human rights, environmental justice, are under attack like never before. And so we need to stand together to protect democracy and to demonstrate what real people power might look like. Secondly, the economic system that we are part of, the global capitalist economic order, in some ways has delivered remarkable benefits. There's no question that if you look just in crude economic terms, yes, we have been raising incomes of many, many billions of people in the last few decades, and levels of extreme poverty are much lower than they were a few decades ago. But it is also true that we live in a world where inequality is increasing in almost every country in the world. And globally, the levels of inequality are skyrocketing. I suppose some of you, I hope, are familiar with Oxfam's annual report looking at extreme wealth. This is the report that shows now only a handful of men, all men, own more wealth put together than the poorest half of the world's population. And every year that Oxfam does that report, the number of men who own that wealth gets smaller and smaller. So we're living in a world that within our own countries, but also if the world were a country, inequality is rising. Meanwhile, far too many people are being left destitute without the basic income they need to survive, working long hours, working in precarious jobs, excuse me, and struggling to make ends meet. And the promise that globalization would create a more equal world no longer holds. All that seems to happen is those who own capital, those who own wealth, have seen higher rewards. The environment is paying a price because globalization and global capitalism relies on extraction from the environment, and nature pays a price. And the rules and regulations that should protect vulnerable people have not been enacted, that workers' rights in many parts of the world are being undermined. And so, again, we need to think about how do we put people back at the heart of the economy? You know, these economic systems are human-made. We've chosen to organize our societies in this way. And here, the good news for us, I think, for progressive civil society, is some of the ways in which we can organize economic life in more equal or egalitarian ways are very familiar to many of us. I mean, many of us have been part of cooperatives, for example, or social enterprises that don't seek to maximize profit or short-term profit. Many of us know how to work in a non-extractive way, that you can still have dynamism and achieve economic goals without being motivated only by profit. And I think there is a challenge for us to demonstrate that there are new forms of economic organization, or maybe even old forms of economic organization, that will help reconnect people to our economic lives, that the things that we do are creating genuine value, and that we feel valued in the process. And I think civil society needs to do a lot more to show that another world is possible, to come up with different models. And in my book, I have a number of ways in which civil society actors, through cooperatives, through collaboratives, through co-creation, are demonstrating these new formations. And let me conclude this bit with just some reflections on our own, on civil society itself as a system. And this comes right back to, I think, the founding mission of the START Network, which is, if we in civil society, if we in the humanitarian sector are to have any chance of being successful in defending civic freedoms, in reimagining democracy, in challenging economic power, we also need to change ourselves. We need to, for example, take people more seriously, that take communities more seriously. When we say we are going to engage communities, we need to mean that. It can't just be tokenistic. You know, as I found during my time at Oxfam, if we're to have any chance of shifting power, we need to start with the people we claim to be serving, that we need to think meaningfully about participation in all that we do, in the design of our programs, in the governance of our programs, in the allocation of our resources. That can't happen from headquarters, whether it's in the national capital or in the donor capital. We've got to do more genuinely bottom-up programming. And again, there are some amazing, inspiring examples within civil society of how we can do that. These are not strange things. If we put our mind to it, we can come up with much more inclusive ways of organizing our own work. Secondly, we need to look within our own organizations. We are not going to challenge power unless we look at how power works within our own organization. If we are very hierarchical, or if power sits in the global north and everyone else in the system simply becomes a sort of contractor or a subcontractor to how power works, that's not good enough. If we don't think about diversity and inclusion within our own organization, if we don't treat each other with the respect that we deserve, we're not going to be taken seriously. And I don't think we'll have as good a chance as we need to demonstrate that we need to change. Thirdly, we need a new architecture. And here I don't need to explain this at all, because I think that to me is what the START Network is about. It's about showing that the outdated humanitarian system can be more effective, can be more sustainable if we change the architecture, if we redistribute power, if we share decision making, if we stop believing that somehow responsive, charitable donations are the best way of addressing humanitarian needs. I mean, how do we even let ourselves believe that after disaster strikes is the most effective way of responding to humanitarian? And I think we do need a new people-centered architecture or redesign of the development and humanitarian architecture. And finally, I think there is for those of us who are interested in internationalism, and I suspect if you're a part of the START network, then I assume that you are, I think there's also an opportunity for civil society to show what the next generation of international architecture needs to look like. Because as I said, when I quoted from your own documents, the 20th century architecture was fine. It served a purpose. But the 21st century architecture and 21st century global decision-making can't rely on these outdated institutions. And what I hope we can do as internationalists is show what a solidarity-based global network can look like, where power doesn't sit just in the global north, where people's voices are taken more seriously, where resources, not just money, but know-how, knowledge, solidarity are shared across these networks. And I think, in a world that's struggling to think about how do we protect internationalism and this frail international architecture, I think those of us in civil society, particularly humanitarian civil society, have a real opportunity to show what another world might look like, that this is how we do solidarity at the global level. So wherever I look, there's no shortage of challenges, whether it's in politics, in economics, in humanitarian need. And I know it's easy to feel disheartened given all the challenges we face. But I think those of us who work on the basis of humanitarian principles, those of us who are inspired by internationalism, I think we have a special role, a special responsibility to lead by example and make sure that this indeed is the century of the citizen. Let me stop there, Christina. Oh, I think you're on mute, Christina.
I'm on mute. Thanks very much for that. Some really, really important messages there, not only for the world that we're sitting in today, but for us as START Network and as a community that has come around the very values that you were talking about, commitments to changing the civil society space and the conversation that happens within it, commitments to changing our own organizations, and commitments, especially within the network, to redesigning the architecture to be able to support those other things and to stand together as civil society and not to stand apart, which humanitarian exceptionalism tends to do. So I'd like to invite all of our participants online right now to put your questions for Danny in the chat. But while you do that, I'm going to take a moment here and the opportunity, I suppose, of being your host, but also being an American, to ask Danny the first question, a question that's been on my mind all day. It may have been on all of your minds all day. But here it is. Danny, your book and your messages, as you've just talked about with us, are about the power of true democracy, of populism, of putting decision-making power not in the hands of elites or institutions or private companies, but in the hands of people. The election result in the US today was not just a win for Donald Trump. It was a mandate for Donald Trump. I mean, people came out in droves. Voter turnout was high. And unlike in previous elections, Donald Trump is expected to have won the popular vote in addition to the Electoral College vote. But Trump isn't a populist, right? He is an elitist whose behavior, whose whole campaign has been about the subversion of the populist voice of democracy, of the subversion of the rule of law in favor of absolute power, isolationism, and nationalism. So Trump stands for being the opposite of what you're talking about, the connection, the solidarity, the standing together of what this people power is meant to bring. So my question to you is putting power, decision-making, democracy in the hands of people always the right thing for society?
So that's a really timely question, and this is on my mind too. But where I sit is that Trump, for me, like other leaders with authoritarian tendencies and populist tendencies, are a symptom of how inadequate democracy feels in terms of representing people's views and engagement. So a lot of people who support Trump, who support the Reform Party in the UK, who've supported figures like Bolsonaro or Duterte in Brazil and Philippines, maybe even the rise of Hindu fundamentalism in India, are expressing their dissatisfaction with the political system. And so they're looking for these leaders who are seen as rebels who can speak for them. And so that's, for me, why it's really important to come up with new forms of democracy, democratic engagement, that people can at least feel a bit more connected to the system, and then therefore are not tempted to vote for or support these figures who want to dismantle the system, right? Who don't care about the system. But there's also an implication for us, because in all of those countries I've spoken about, it's become very easy to point to people who believe in human rights or believe in democracy or believe in humanitarianism and demonize us because we are disconnected from reality. We're funded by foreigners or foreign governments. We are ourselves part of elites. We drive around in our nice cars in capital cities and we don't really know what. And so I think there is a lesson for those of us in civil society, particularly the sort of organized, professionalized bits of civil society, that we don't become too easy to demonize, and therefore we can't challenge some of this. So I think there's a wider structural system challenge for democracy, but also a role that we have there as well within that to speak truth to power more effectively.
And what do we do in the meantime?
We stand up and we do. That's why the reform of our own system is important, and that we need to be more connected to people. And that's in the long term, that's going to matter. In the short term, we need to stand together and speak out when these populist leaders try to dismantle our system. And I think we build power. I mean, a phrase that someone in South Africa used with me that I love, that I hope that inspires me, is we need to build from below, but beyond borders as well. And to me, that's what's been missing. We need to build from below. So start with the people we care about, start with the communities that we work in, build power from there. But that's not enough, because we also need a new internationalism, right? If we're going to have any chance of addressing humanitarian need, of climate change, of global inequity, we need global structures and of solidarity. And so I think we need to sort of be really conscious of that in all that we do. Are we building from below and beyond borders?
Okay, I'm going to try to get a question in that actually dovetails really nicely with what you just said. It's a question from one of our members in Somalia. And the question is, how can we make the 3%, I think you mentioned something about the 3%, ambassadors for a freer world? And that 3% ambassadors, from learning, for learning from societies, for building from the ground up, as you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a fabulous question, because those 3% of people, those societies are almost all of them in Northern Europe, in places like Scandinavia, or I think it's Canada is one of those countries. And there it's really, I think the lesson is also for those of us who are interested in civil society that, those are countries where there is a diverse, vibrant, resilient civil society, right? That has its own resources, that has a legitimacy and credibility. And in many parts of the world, those of us particularly who work in the development system, have not done enough to build the diverse, resilient civil society, right? We've created subcontractors who are relying on foreign funding, for example. And so therefore they're not particularly resilient, and they're easy to demonize because they're seen as puppets. And so I think we do need to learn from those examples. Those, again, in the humanitarian and development system, we need to say, well, if we're going to have any chance of moving countries that are a bit, not in the 3%, back up to there. What are we going to do? What's the long-term strategy to strengthen civil society in those places? Which to me leads us to thinking about how do we build that diverse, resilient, connected, accountable civil society.
Great, Danny. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. We're on the hour. We have another session next. But listen, it's been great having you. It's been great for you to give us kind of more food for thought in how we take Start Network forward. There's been many more questions in the chat, and I will see if we can maybe pass them along to you, or at least maybe publish them so that we could all be thinking about the same things. But thanks very much. Good luck with your book. Good luck with the new job. And thanks so much for always being a supporter of Start Network and the work that we're doing. Take care.